The perception process. In this chapter, we're going to look at how we're perceiving the world around us and how that impacts our communication, the influences of perception, some of the common tendencies in perception, and what we can do to synchronize those perceptions. There will be various videos in this presentation lecture, and a couple of them will be required for discussion, so be sure to pay close attention. You're going to, hopefully by the end of this lecture, you'll understand the 4 steps in perception, be able to identify some of those influences on perception, and recognize how some common tendencies shape your own perception of others and what you think of others when you come into a conversation, and also help you develop and shape your interpersonal communication as we continue to grow towards being competent communicators. And you will learn how perception checking and adjusting our attitudes and using empathy is very helpful in the communication process. So when you look at these cubes, what do you see? How many ways can you look at them? So I look at them as a box. I see that I can fold it together. If I turn the direction of my head as I'm looking at the screen, I can see that I can fold it flat. I see a V in the middle. They look like maybe they're a glass display and so on. What do you see? So perceptions affect our communication with others in multiple ways. As we look at this image, we can see it in different ways. And if we were in a classroom next to each other, we would all see many similar things, but many different things. And I missed a slide. What did I do? There we go. So there are 4 ways initially that our authors found that we can view these cubes. We can place them in different modes, if you will. It's very interesting that our perception process and our reality play a very important role. So when we think about communication, we think about our culture, our values, our beliefs, how that influences how we communicate to others. And with perception, how we communicate with others. So our knowledge is filtered through perception, which affects our communication. So our first order of realities, when we looked at the diagram, we looked at the physical observation. What does the thing look like, or what does a situation look like when you hear people speaking loud? My assumption when I first got exposed to the Puerto Rican culture, I thought that people were arguing and fighting. And soon enough, I learned that was just the way they communicate. They're a culture that speaks lively and loudly to each other. And sometimes some families, what seem to be a lot of insults, are just endearments. So my first order of reality initially was something negative, but as I got familiar with the families I interacted with, I realized that I could attach a positive meaning to that. Our second order of reality is when we start to attach meaning to the first thing or situation that we see. So our knowledge has its origin in our perceptions. So what are some ways that this can affect your communication with others? Maybe you approach someone and you think they're in a bad mood, so you assume that their response is because they're being rude towards you. That's a first order of reality. Attaching meaning to that could consider maybe they had a death in the family, maybe something terrible happened, maybe they had a flat tire on the way to work. And so how we interpret this information is really important. When we select data, we pay attention to the immediate stimulus that's in front of us. So the intensity of it, the repetition of it, and is it changing? So when we go into the same coffee shop, if you will, we get familiar, and the moment something changes, our reality within perception will change because something's different. So we create our reality with others through communication. What is the perception process? There are 4 steps in the perception process. Selection, which involves the data that we attend to. What draws my eyes? Is it the red dress? Is it the painting on the wall? And what attracts my attention? That intensity I mentioned earlier, the repetition and the contrast or the change. So my selection is what I see at first. And what I do with that selection is what the next step is about. This is a short video that I'd like you to take a moment to watch so that you can start to gain an understanding of the perception process. I had to pause for a moment because I realized that in the YouTube videos, you will not be able to select the link. You'll have to come back to the actual file posted in the module to access the links. The next step in the perception process is organization. Organization is step number 2, and it's the stage where we select the information. That's stage 1. But then we're starting to add meaning to it, arrange it in a certain way where we're starting to make sense of what we're looking at. We're classifying it, if you will. We're organizing the data. We're looking at the physical aspect. We're looking at titles or roles. We're looking at the interaction. We're looking at the psychology behind it. All of these pieces come together when we start to organize our thoughts. So when I walked into that room and I saw all these people talking and their hands waving, and I'm thinking, okay, what do I see? It looks like somebody's about to have a fight. Voices are loud. I'm starting to organize in step 2 of the perception process. Punctuation. So when we think about punctuation, we're relating that to the determination that we're making of the causes and the effects that take place. And so in punctuation, we're looking at, are people withdrawing? Are they demanding? Are they withdrawing, demanding, withdrawing? So what is it that we're focusing on is the punctuation. And so these are important factors that occur rather quickly. I mean, it happens very quickly. So this is part of the organization step. Then we have the interpretation step. That's step number 3. The interpretation occurs when we're actually putting meaning to it. So I walk in, I see these people, I see these hands, I see all these people yelling, and I'm thinking, oh my God, they're having an argument. But then the relational part of it, my connection, my personal experience with them, my own personality, what I know about their personalities, some assumptions. And of course, this is an in-person experience, not an online experience in my situation that I'm describing. So as I start to look around, I realize, oh, these are siblings. They love each other. They care. They're sharing things about something exciting that happened. So I'm beginning to interpret that information. And the factors that we mentioned are all the factors that would influence how we're interpreting this information. And then finally, now again, all of this is happening very quickly. Steps 1 through 4 happen very quickly. Negotiation. Negotiation is the next step in the process, which is where we explain or view the interpersonal communication exchange. What is the story that's being told? What do I see that I can describe? How am I comparing this and making sense of it? So it's not just a personal process, it is an interpersonal process, and we make all these connections so that we can at least attempt most of the time to make a very clear decision about our perception of what we're experiencing. When we think back on the Louise Evans video on the chairs, that was a great example of how the perception process took place. And I'm thinking, yeah, the chairs was earlier. I couldn't remember if it was after this slide or not. But if you haven't seen it, go back and watch it. So what types of things, in addition to everything that we talked about in the 4 steps of the perception process, influence perception? Well, there's a variety of factors that influence how we select and negotiate information. How much information do we have access to? What information physiologically do we have access to, or what's influencing the environment that we're looking at? And it also impacts our interpretation as far as what we smell, what we see, how we're feeling. Are we tired? Are we hungry? There are a variety of aspects in this process that are going to influence how we organize and negotiate this exchange. So our perception process, in addition to those 4 steps, is greatly influenced by a variety of physiological and psychological behaviors. Another list of influences includes social influences. And the social influence just helps us understand where our view is in society in general. And the standpoint theory describes what our position is in a society and how we use that position to define the roles that are around us. So we're talking about culture, we're talking about environment influences. So sex and gender roles can be very significant in the perception process. How do I feel about males, females? How do I feel about different identifying gender roles, occupational roles, titles, relational roles? And I think if you come from a high context environment, you're going to be influenced by that. You know, titles may be a very big thing. Some titles are very valuable and some aren't. You know, it just depends on what you're dealing with. So culture influences our selection, organization, interpretation, and negotiation in a major way. It impacts how we view others. And I think it's important to understand how it influences us in a variety of ways. Do we have a broad perspective? Are we open-minded? what's impacting how we interpret the world around us. And that's going to have a great impact on how we attribute meaning to the things that we are seeing or experiencing. So this is another short video, and I'd like to encourage you to watch it. It will provide you some additional insight on how we are influenced in the perception process. So when we think about what our common tendencies are, so we talked about how culture influences that, but we also have challenges with how we're attributing meaning. What's influencing my meaning? So I think about when I was younger, I grew up in an area where it was highly influenced by gangs, and it was very challenging for me as a kid. I also got held up. I had an attempt carjack happen to me, so I've had a weapon pointed at me. And so I struggle with certain things. Even as an adult in my 60s, I have to really take a moment, take a step back, because I have a tendency to attribute presently my experience from the past, which can also cause me to have a snap judgment. So when I become very quick in judging and assuming something, and that can be very problematic. Falls into the category of stereotyping, right? Applying these meanings to a situation that I haven't even experienced. So I'm really grateful that at this point in my life, I've learned to categorize based on not just what is recognizable to me, but other characteristics. I can hold back and wait until I share or have an exchange with the person that I'm being challenged with. How do I look at members of certain groups, and how do I challenge myself, right, to be courageous and step into that world for a moment? And then 99.9% of the time I have a very positive experience. So working on avoiding generalizations, applying generalizations are really important. But all of that came from the experiences that I had when I was 12, 13, up until 16. So it was just very challenging. What are some of the things that you haven't thought about that you're thinking about right now that might influence how you judge someone? I think I've shared before, sometimes I'll receive messages from students and it's hard for me to understand if they're actually being short with me or if they're just in a hurry and just sent a message out to me without thinking about what they were saying or clarifying. So I have to be cautious about snap judgments. I have to be gentle. I have to be empathetic in my responses. So the perception process can really challenge us when we begin to understand what it is that we're doing. So as we become adults, we develop some of our habits are good, some of our habits aren't so good. And so we have to begin to identify what are those biases that I have. How do I isolate those behaviors? How do I avoid inaccurate beliefs driving my perception of the world around me? And so I want to develop a consistent approach, being cognitively consistent. And so the dark side of this process are being challenged by these implicit biases. So those things that affect us interpersonally. And also implicit biases can cause us to cling to first impressions. And so our initial impressions can have more weight, and we have to be very careful about that. In your textbook, there is a reference to the research on implicit biases. So some of these tendencies can drive stereotyping and other unconscious responses. And so we have to be very careful how we're managing those. So I want you to begin to be alert and aware of what those are. So our first impressions can be a problem when we're looking at the perception process. What's our initial impression? And sometimes these impressions are based on, as I mentioned before, like my childhood experiences. So the primary effect is a tendency to pay more attention to things that happen first in a sequence. So something that happens first, you take that impression and you hold that for the rest of the evening. So if you have a negative impression, that's going to carry through the rest of the evening. The halo effect, it's a tendency to form an impression of someone based on an initial impression. So overall, you have a positive impression. So you take that one positive impression and you develop an opinion about this person, or you have a perception. And the halo effect, think about an angel with a halo. Oh, you think they're great, they're wonderful. Have you ever had that happen with someone that you thought was amazing, and then later they weren't so amazing? That was the halo effect. The horns effect, the devil or pitchfork effect. The horns effect is the tendency to let an initial negative appraisal influence the perception. So it's the opposite of the halo effect. And finally, we have confirmation bias. And this is where we seek out and organize impressions to support our initial opinion. So what we might do is, I'm not really sure about this person. I'm going to inquire and start asking some questions to get more information. Confirmation bias. So we have a tendency to be harder on ourselves and more charitable towards others. And that is just a natural, fundamental attribution error. We attribute that we're better than others. It's just a natural tendency. But it's also a great error that we tend to give more weight to our personal qualities than we do to others. And as you start to listen to your self-talk or things that are going on inside, when you're not verbalizing them, you'll start to recognize some things about yourself that you may not have recognized before. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's actually, I think, healthy and amazing, because it causes you to form a stronger, more solid interpersonal communication interaction. That's becoming a competent communicator. A self-serving bias is a tendency to blame external forces when something goes poorly for us, or if we've performed poorly. So we want to make sure that we're credited in a positive way, so we don't take basically responsibility for it. So that's a self-serving bias. What might be some of those tendencies that we talked about that might influence social media? Are you more critical of people, how they use their social media? Are your appraisals to close friends kinder than those to people that you don't know as well? What is it that you're doing? So take the time to think about that, because it can be problematic when the most obvious factor is not the only one. So you want to make sure to synchronize your perception. So we are influenced by expectations, we are influenced by what's obvious to us, and we assume others are like us. And this could be definitely a fallacy because others are not like us. We may share some things in common, but when it comes down to it, we have so many differences. So in the perception checking process, we want to be able to identify things clearly. Can you think of a time when you were influenced by an expectation of another person or your own expectations? I can think of something recently that I just assumed somebody knew and understood that they weren't supposed to exchange some information. However, in their mind, they thought they weren't hurting anyone. And to me, it was like a major never do this situation. And it took me a little bit to understand their side of the story and understand why they chose to do it. And that was their approach, that was their perception. I didn't give clear boundaries, so my bad. And often we have to think about how I've set things up, right? What is my perception responsibility? Am I checking myself? Am I, making snap judgments? What is it that I can do to help clarify the interaction? And so one of the things that's healthy is having empathy. There's a difference between empathy and sympathy. Empathy is when you're taking a perspective of the other person. You're reviewing the behavior, understanding that you have more than one interpretation, so you have to carefully select that interpretation, organize those thoughts, and ask for clarification from the person. Don't just assume they did it because they were evil or they wanted to hurt you. There might have been a reason. Yeah, there might be some instances where that happens, but honestly, you want to be able to come at these situations, especially when it relates to perception, with some empathy. So what is empathy? And how does that impact our communication? So we want to check our perception and align the possible options that are available for the behavior, and then seek more information. But empathy is the ability to recreate another person's perspective, to experience the world from their point of view. You've heard that saying, you don't know X until you've walked in my shoes, right? So that's the same thing as being able to experience their point of view. And through taking their perception process, experiencing empathy will also allow us to have some emotional contagion where we have a genuine concern for the person and we can really feel what's happening or why they chose to do what they did. Sympathy is viewing the person's situation from your own personal point of view, so sympathy is different from empathy. The difference between empathy and sympathy is empathy allows you to take perspective of the other person, you connect emotions with the other person, and you have a genuine concern. Whereas sympathy, you're just giving the person's situation, connecting with that from your perspective. I'm sorry that you feel that way. I'm sorry that that happened to you. and empathy would be a little deeper. I'm so sorry that you had that person talk to you that way. I had that happen to me once and it just broke me. But remember, I got through it, you will get through it. This is another video I'd like you to watch. It gives you a perspective on the approach to empathy and what it's about. I think that when we experience empathy, it's difficult with people who are very different from us, whether it's sex, age, socioeconomic, etc. Being open-minded is very important. It will help us in our commitment to overcome the obstacles that impact us. So be sure to go back to the PowerPoint slides to view these videos. So it's hard to empathize with people who are different from us. And just a reminder, you want to be open-minded and you want to be sure to make those connections. So what can you do to understand someone's perspective? Ask. Ask about the infraction if there was an infraction. Understand what that was about. Don't allow your own critique to influence somebody else's behavior. Check your appraisals. How are you appraising other people? How are you judging them? Think about the 4 chairs and what the options were in that short video. Consider your self-talk. Is your self-talk negative? That's going to affect your perception. So the golden rule illustrates that relationships between empathy and ethical principles enable society to function. There are different types of treatment for offenders, often involving trying to instill empathy. So why is empathy so important? How does it connect to ethical behavior? Can you think of some examples? Jot them down. So in this chapter, we understood the 4 steps in the perception process. We looked at a variety of influences. We recognized some of those common tendencies that shape our communication, interpersonal communication process, and learning to understand, to do some perception checking. Check yourself, be accountable. And don't forget, all of the videos that are shown in the YouTube recorded lectures, the links are available in the PowerPoint files in the modules. Thank you.